Then down it came again into the yard, splosh. And there it sat with its feathers all sticking out straight from its body. There was a look of amazement on its stupid face. "You've done it in, you stupid boy," Grandma shouted. "That hen's gonna die. Your father'll be after you now. He'll give you a hiding and serve you right." But now the hen began to grow. George had been waiting for this to happen. "It's growing," he yelled. "Grandma, look, it's growing." Bigger and bigger, taller and taller it grew. Soon the hen was 4 or 5 times its normal size. "Can you see it, Grandma?" George shouted. "I can see it, boy," the old girl shouted back. "I'm watching it." George was hopping about from one foot to the other with excitement. "It's had the magic medicine, Grandma, and it's growing, just like you did." But there was a difference between the way the hen was growing and the way Grandma grew. When Grandma grew taller and taller, she got thinner and thinner. The hen didn't. It stayed nice and plump all along. Soon it was taller than George. But it didn't stop there. It went right on growing until it was about as big as a horse. And then it stopped. "Doesn't it look marvellous, Grandma?" George shouted. "Well, it's not as tall as me," Grandma sang out. "Compared with me, that hen is titchy small. I am the tallest of them all. It's for pork, big as sheep for mutton." And they went to the pigsty first. George gave a spoonful of medicine to the pig, and in a few moments, this is what it looked like. And the same thing happened when Mr. Cranky's herd of fine black bullocks each had a dose of George's medicine. After that, it was the sheep. Then George gave some to his grey pony, Jack Frost. And finally, just for fun, he gave some to Alma, the nanny goat. Grandma, from high up on the rooftop, could see everything that was going on, and she didn't like what she saw. She wanted to be the centre of attention, and nobody was taking the slightest notice of her. George and Mr. Cranky were running round and getting excited about the enormous animals. Mrs. Cranky was washing up in the kitchen, and Grandma was all alone on the rooftop. "Hey, you!" she yelled. "George, get me a cup of tea this minute, you idle little beast." "Don't listen to the old goat," Mr. Cranky said. "She's stuck where she is, and a good thing too." "Well, we can't leave her up there, Dad," George said. "What if it rains?" "George!" Grandma yelled. "Ugh, you horrible little boy! You disgusting little worm! Fetch me a cup of tea at once, and a slice of currant cake." "We'll have to get her out, Dad," George said. "She won't give us any peace if we don't." Mrs. Cranky came outside and agreed with George. "She's my mother," she said. "She's a pain in the neck," Mr. Cranky said. "I don't care," Mrs. Cranky said. "I'm not leaving my own mother sticking up through the roof for the rest of her life." So in the end, Mr. Cranky telephoned the crane company and asked them to send one of their biggest cranes out to the house at once. The crane arrived 1 hour later. It was on wheels, and there were 2 men inside it. They put ropes under Grandma's arms, and then she was lifted right up through the roof. In a way, the medicine had done Grandma good. It hadn't made her any less grumpy or bad-tempered, but it seemed to have cured all her aches and pains. And she was suddenly as frisky as a ferret. As soon as the crane had lowered her to the ground, she ran over to George's huge pony, Jack Frost, and jumped on his back. Then the ancient old hag galloped about the farm on the gigantic pony, jumping over trees and sheds and shouting, "Get out of my way! Clear the decks! Stand aside, all you miserable midgets, or I'll trample you all to death!" Yeah, and other silly things like that. But because Grandma was now much too tall to get back into the house, she had to sleep that night in the hay barn with the mice and the rats. And the next day, George's father came down to breakfast in a state of even greater excitement than ever. "I have been awake all night thinking about it," he cried. "About what, Dad?" George asked him. "About your marvellous medicine, of course. We can't stop now, my boy. We must start making more of it at once." "But why do we need more, Dad?" George asked. "We've done all our own animals, and we've made Grandma feel as frisky as a ferret, even though she does have to sleep in the barn." "My dear boy," cried Mr. Killy Cranky, "we need barrels and barrels of it. Tons and tons. Then we will sell it to every farmer in the world, so that all of them can have giant animals. We will build a marvellous medicine factory and sell the stuff in bottles at £5 a time. We will become rich, You will become famous. But wait a minute, Dad, said George. There's no waiting, cried Mr. Cranky, working himself up so much that he put butter in his coffee and milk on his toast. Don't you understand what this tremendous invention of yours is going to do to the world? Nobody will ever go hungry again. Why won't they? Asked George. Because one giant cow will give 50 buckets of milk a day. One giant chicken will make 100 fried chicken dinners. And one giant pig will give you 1,000 pork chops. It's tremendous. My dear boy, it's fantastic. It'll change the world. But wait a minute, Dad, George said again. Don't keep saying wait a minute, shouted Mr. Cranky. There isn't a minute to wait. We must get cracking at once. Do calm down, my dear, Mrs. Cranky said from the other end of the table.